morning, everybody. Okay, beautiful crowd. Also, I love your scarf. I saw it as soon as you walked in. Gorgeous, amazing. Need the details. My name is Gatti Tassin. I am thrilled to be here with you this morning. I'm also a walker, so I'm going to be moving and dancing across the stage a little bit today. And as you heard, I am the founder of the finance media brand Money with Katie and the author of Rich Girl Nation, taking charge of our financial futures. So last night, you heard from a state senator, and you heard from a very, very successful entrepreneur. The kids call me a finfluencer, financial influencer, and if that's not the saddest thing you've ever heard, I don't know what is. But I share Antoinette's request for you today. I would love for you to keep your imagination open and your heart receptive to the things that I'm going to share with you, because I began writing about personal finance in 2020, and yes, I had this mission to teach young women in particular about how they could secure their financial futures. And I consider myself baptized in a movement called Financial Independence, Retire Early. So, financial independence, retire early. This is a realm of the personal finance world that really believes that you are not free if you depend on a job or another person for money, if you have to trade your time for money, we'll say. And I found that extremely compelling. I had been working full-time for about 6 months, and I was like, yeah, sister, sign me up. I completely agree that I am not free right now driving to my full-time job. And that's really what I did for a couple of years. I sat in front of a whiteboard, and I gesticulated wildly about Roth IRAs and tax breaks. And I think it's interesting in retrospect that I was so attracted to FIRE ideology based on where I ended up. Because philosophically speaking, it is actually quite radical. And I know on the surface that might sound kind of ludicrous, but like I said, the ethos of financial independence is that you are not free as long as somebody else owns your time. Now, I'm going to use a scary word now. This is a quote from a book about Marxist philosophies. For Marx, freedom required that people have independence over their work, over their time, and over their bodies. And since most people in capitalist society lack such self-rule and must sell their labor to survive, capitalism is incompatible with freedom. Now, I know what you're thinking. Oh my God, she used the word Marxism in the first 5 minutes. This is not for me. I am out of here. But I am including this to make the point that the sound strategies of financial independence that I still follow personally and individually really point to a broader belief, a deeper belief in human freedom and flourishing than I had even realized at the time, and that thinkers of all philosophical stripes throughout history, from Milton Friedman and Adam Smith to Karl Marx himself, have been asking and trying to answer these very deep questions about how an economic system boosts or impedes human freedom. This is a question that we've been trying to answer for a very long time, so we're going to come back to that. But here's what happened next. I felt really strongly about personal finance, okay? I loved personal finance. I was so excited about it, I was obsessed. Every Saturday morning, I would wake up at like 6 a.m., and I would write my little blog posts about HSA funds and, tax strategies. And at some point in the summer of 2020, we all remember what we were doing at that time, I decided, I think I want to pursue this as a career. I think I want to be an entrepreneur. But I had no idea how to do that, and I had no experience in media. So I really didn't understand how media companies worked. But I thought, you know what? I am going to commit to publishing 2 blog posts per week for 1 year. And we'll see what happens, right? 104 blog posts. If at the end of that year, no one's reading it and I'm miserable and nobody cares, I'll stop doing it. But it didn't stay 2 blog posts for long, because like I said, I was obsessed. I was very into money. So soon I started making videos. And then I launched my first product. I still sell this product, by the way. It's way better now. And then I launched a podcast. And in November of 2021, a business media brand called Morning Brew approached me about running Money with Katie full-time for them. So I sold 100% of Money with Katie. I sold 100% of my brand to Morning Brew. And after my employment from that acquisition kicked off in January 2022, I figured, all right, sweet, got my deal, I got my career path laid out in front of me, masterful pivot I have pulled off here. I'm gonna go the way of the Dave Ramseys of the world. I'm gonna unseat him and come for his throne in the financial kingdom. And that's what I'm gonna do with the rest of my life. I'm gonna rally around the glories of capitalism and teach people how to get rich and invest their money. And then I received my first medical bill. And that was a radicalizing experience. And it sent me down a path to start to understand things about the world that I yet did not know. So you know that this is not where the story ends. After a few years of doing this work, I started to notice a little bit of a problem with the earn more, spend less, invest the difference mantra that I had been preaching very faithfully. Now, part of this work that I was doing involved meeting with a lot of women and talking to a lot of women about their financial situations, about their challenges. I met women of all incomes, I met women of all ages, of all backgrounds, and sometimes what they told me about the situations they were in confronted me with an uncomfortable truth about the way the world works and about the way the American economy works. And this was a little bit disconcerting for me because I really wanted to share solutions that would work for anybody and would work for everybody. And in the beginning, I really, really thought they did. But as time went on and I learned more, I was confronted with the reality of income inequality in the United States. This is a distribution of income in the United States. So you will see that green line at the bottom, that is the bottom 50% of our country, average real income. Now, sometimes we call that the working class, sometimes we call it lower class, but no matter what we call it, this is a group that has really not benefited from the fact that our country's GDP and productivity has been steadily rising for decades. That next tranche, the middle 40%, their wages really haven't grown either. Now, this is the group that we call the middle class. And here's the kicker. That group in the top 10% up there, I'm gonna show you that one more time. Top 10% is red, top 1% is yellow, right? But that group in the top 10%, whose incomes have risen a little bit more in line with this growth, they also own 87% of the stock market. And the stock market, in case you didn't know, has done really, really well in the last couple of years. And it is partially why, to this day, I still encourage every person to invest in it if they can. But I think it's important to think about what stock market returns are. Because if you are a shareholder, your return, what that represents, is the company's profits, right? Or the amount of money that that company is able to make after they pay all of their expenses, including the wages of the people who are producing that value. So in that sense, maximizing stock market returns inevitably involves downward pressure on the wages of those people in the bottom 50 and the bottom 40%, because those wages, hey, the truth is they take away from the profits. I want to use an example that's a little less abstract because I think the public stock market can be, it's a little esoteric. But it's a little bit like the housing market. The housing market works for some people really, really well. And it works for some people really, really well because it cannot work for everybody. Housing can only be an asset that rises in value faster than inflation every year and builds wealth for the people who own it because it is not affordable and accessible to everyone. There are individual solutions for individual people, right? We talk about these all the time. You can navigate this reality. You can hustle and scrape by to buy a home. You can hustle your way into the top 10%. But they cannot work for everybody at the same time. The system is not designed for that to happen. And In both cases, public market investing, housing market investing, what have you, that narrow scope of focus means that we are never really addressing the underlying problem. And what I came to realize is that financial advice does not scale well in our current iteration of society. So, when we critique capitalism, I've used that word a couple times now, and I really want to drill down on what specifically I'm talking about. It is helpful to define specifically what I am critiquing. And to do this, we have to understand what features actually define the system of capitalism. What made capitalism definitionally different than the things that came before it and other economic systems. Now, it's common to associate capitalism with things like competition and wealth and markets and commerce. And yes, it is true that all of those things are components of this system, but capitalism is not defined by those things. Those things existed for hundreds, in some cases thousands of years before capitalism as a system developed. And a capitalist system would not be required for those things to continue to exist. The defining feature of capitalism is that it is a system that divides people into two major groups, okay? This is where the financial independence definition is going to come back around. You have people who work for money, and you have people for whom money works. Those are the two groups. Now, there are obviously significant differences between someone who works for money for $8 an hour and someone who works for money for $200,000 a year, but in both cases, you're trading your time for money. Now, being in the capital class is not just about being rich. The real defining feature of being somebody for whom money works is that you have all the power. You get to decide, if you are in the capital class, what is produced, how much is produced, how it is produced, for whose benefit, and under what conditions. And so by the nature of that immense wealth and power, you in effect control the labor force, you control what work people can do, and as a result, you get to shape society. The laborers then, those of us who work for money, we then get to decide among the choices that the capital class provides to us. We get to decide what work we want to do, what job we want to take, in exchange for what wage they're willing to pay us. We negotiate and try to get that wage up. But in a Western liberal democracy, we value the idea of one person, one vote, that every person should have a say in how society is structured. Economically, we do not live in that world. And so when we criticize capitalism, we are specifically critiquing that anti-democratic distribution of power. We are critiquing the fact that an unbelievably small number of people get to make outsized decisions that shape society for everybody else in profound ways. And I personally look at that and I go, I think we can do better. I think we can do better than that. I think we should strive for a democratic economy too. Now, what I am offering here is an analysis of an economic system, okay? So this is not an indictment of someone who has managed to earn a top 10% income or invest in the stock market or invest in real estate. I feel strongly that we need to understand and scrutinize the systems that produce these outcomes. I think until you change the system, if all the incentives stay the same, you are going to continue getting the same results. I am personally heavily invested in the stock market. I have worked hard to earn great money, and I want those same things for everybody who reads my book. But for the majority of Americans, personal finance advice is absolutely necessary and woefully insufficient. So, this knowledge sent me on a mission to understand that economic system and to explore alternate systems. I also desperately wanted to understand why so many people, myself included, and even those for whom this system was not working very well, seemed to feel so strongly that our current iteration of American capitalism was the only possible way that we could structure society. Even if so few of us were truly thriving within it. And the answer became obvious. We often just could not imagine anything different. We couldn't imagine something better. And so I made it my personal mission to understand this. I read I don't know how many books. I interviewed I don't know how many people. And today I want to reveal my most interesting and impactful field notes from 4 years of asking this question to some of the most brilliant writers, economists, policymakers, lawyers, thinkers that I had the opportunity to meet, who have devoted their lives and their studies to helping us imagine that better future. And by studying these examples that we're going to talk about today, I think that we in this room can lead in our spheres of influence and begin to build that world that we would rather see. I think that we deserve that world. And so finally, at the end, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I learned and how it influenced me in starting my next business. Because after everything that I have learned about the American economic system and the ideal of the American dream over the last 4 years, I believe that there are 3 major shifts that would radically improve people's lives. So today we are going to focus on 3 key components of these takeaways: universal basic services, the public ownership of public goods, and replacing at-will employment with democratic workplaces. So first up, we're going to talk about the collective wealth that would be required to provide something like universal basic services. One of the most influential figures in my journey to understand this problem was a guy named Matt Bruenig. He's a lawyer, he's a policy analyst. He's the founder of something called the People's Policy Project. And Matt calls his plan for a social wealth fund, quote, not a pie-in-the-sky idea, but rather a practical plan with dozens of working models currently in operation. He calls this the American Solidarity Fund. This is a project which would issue a share to every American that cannot be transferred or sold, but would pay a universal basic dividend in his plan annually from the investment income that is earned by this fund. So it's sort of like if you were to take an entire country and you were to apply the FIRE principles to it. You accumulate the investments, you gather all the wealth that this economy, that this country is collectively producing, and then you distribute that wealth to the people producing it. Other countries have implemented or attempted to implement similar structures. One relevant historical example that Matt taught me about comes from Sweden in the form of the Meidner Plan in the 1980s. So this did not end up panning out politically. They tried it for about 10 years, and then the government changed hands and they paused it. But I think it is really, really illustrative of how something like this might work. So wealth had become very concentrated at the top of the distribution in Sweden by the 1980s. Does that sound familiar? Things had really, really gotten a little bit out of hand. And the Meidner Plan was implemented because the government of Sweden had a couple of goals. They wanted low inflation. They wanted full employment. So they wanted everybody working. They wanted high growth. And they wanted income equality that maximized fairness. Now, along the way, they built a very robust welfare state, one that is the envy of the modern world today. But part of the reason that they were able to pull something like this off for the time that they did is because Sweden is a country that has extremely high union density. 70% of Swedish workers belong to unions, and these unions were a critical part of making this plan happen. So, how did it work? The Meidner Plan did something pretty simple. It taxed corporate profits at a rate of 20%. And the intention was to gradually transfer ownership of Sweden's corporations from private shareholders to funds that were administered by the country's labor unions. So it was not intended to create individual funds at individual companies. They felt that that would ultimately undermine worker solidarity. And they wanted to maximize that solidarity. They wanted people to see themselves as part of a whole. But the plan assembled ownership in one pool that was collectively owned by the workers of that economy. And in essence, it was really trying to distribute that ownership to the people who were working to create the value. Now, this was a notable departure from what had been common in Sweden at the time, the middle way, which mostly left ownership concentrated in private hands. By 1991, the program had managed to buy up around 7% of Swedish company stock, and unfortunately, we never got to see the end of that experiment. But we did get to see success in another Scandinavian country, another Nordic government. You knew we were going to stay in the Scandinavia region of the world. They have really figured this out well. The Norwegian government owns around 59% of the country's wealth. And they own this across a couple different funds and programs. In 2017, when Matt was putting together this policy proposal, he estimated that the returns on the funds that Norway's government owns would be enough to pay every single Norwegian family $100,000 per year. And he says this, he says, to be sure, Norway is an outlier in the world in terms of just how much wealth it has accumulated in its various social wealth funds. Bear in mind they have a ton of oil, right? But this is also what makes it such a promising example. And this is the thing that I think is really important for the US, because we also have a tremendous amount of money in this country. The idea that a society could collectively own 3/4 of its non-home wealth through social wealth funds administered by a democratically elected government without any negative economic consequences would be rejected as preposterous by most political and economic commentators in America today. But that is precisely what Norway has done, and seemingly what any country could do if it had the necessary will and competence. Norway has a very, very successful economy. I don't remember the exact per capita income off the top of my head, but I do think it is higher than the US's at this point. So rather than use that wealth to pay out cash dividends, they're not mailing checks to people. That's not what they've decided to do with that wealth. Norway uses the money instead to fund world-class social welfare programs. They created universal basic services as opposed to a universal basic income. So healthcare, education, childcare, elder care, university, these are all things that they looked at and said, you know what? Everybody needs these to live a dignified life. And so while these plans might look different around the world, and the more ambitious attempts like the Meidner Plan ultimately were thwarted by political change, I think they represent inspiration for the United States and what could be possible here. So you all know the next question. If you've ever watched, a presidential debate, how do we pay for it? How would we pay for that? Where would the money come from? Now, generally speaking, there are 5 major ways that you could bring assets into a social wealth fund like this. Like I said, Matt is a policy analyst, he's a lawyer, he's really into the details, and so he has built out a whole roadmap for how something like this could happen, but it comes down to a couple of options. The first is that you could add assets to this fund through voluntary contributions. So I told you 10% of the population owns 87% of the market. We're all gonna die someday, right? That money's gonna go somewhere. If you had the top decile of those equity holders eventually contributing half of their holdings upon death. Half goes to your kids, half goes to the country. That fund, within just a couple of decades, would come to hold 40% of all corporate equities. Another way that you could grow this fund would be to transfer existing state assets into it. So the things that the state already owns, you put those in. The United States government owns a large amount of physical assets. The assets include over 450 million acres of land valued at $1.8 trillion, according to Matt, over 900,000 buildings worth hundreds of billions of dollars, thousands of miles of intercoastal waterway, countless infrastructure projects. They also own the electromagnetic spectrum, which it currently auctions off to telecommunications companies. Of course, you also have taxes, everyone's favorite. And Bruning told me that he thinks that capital taxes would be the most sensible place to start. So for example, there could be a one-time market capitalization tax on public companies. And companies could pay in kind. So this means rather than putting actual cash in, they could contribute their shares. They could issue new shares to this fund. A one-off, just one-time tax of 3% would very conservatively be worth around $1 trillion. A much smaller market cap could happen in an ongoing sense. A much smaller market cap tax, rather, could be payable in shares and ongoing. But there are also taxes that could be levied on major mergers and acquisitions, or high volume financial transactions for trading activity. If you've got a lot of Wall Street trading going on, taxing a lot of that activity. You could also use inheritance and gift taxes. The point is, there are a lot of untapped sources that this could come from that would look pretty politically reasonable. And finally, the US currently has a variety of tax breaks that are oriented toward promoting individual asset building. Now, these are tax breaks that primarily benefit people who are already fairly well off and upwardly mobile. You can read all about them in Chapter 6 of Virtual Nation. I'll tell you how to use them. But they do not appear, when you look at the data, to actually achieve their stated purpose of incentivizing saving. And so if just those tax expenditures were lowered or eliminated, the revenue could be redistributed to a fund of this kind. Now, as you've heard, these wealth funds can be used for paying out dividends directly to citizens. Having interviewed other experts like Grace Blakely, an economics and politics journalist in the UK who studies capitalism specifically, I come down on the side of those universal basic services. I think that there is a slate of services that are treated as the baseline life experience below which no American's quality of life should ever fall. And I think that an economy in which quality care, education, and health are treated as just baseline benefits of being an American, my perspective is that you would see economic productivity and innovation like never before. I think it would be absolutely explosive. And that is what excites me most about that path, is that I think it is a small investment to make in what will ultimately radically improve the quality of life for just about everybody. And this brings me to my second major field notes area of study, which is the privatization of public goods. I have to tell you, a lot of what I did not understand about America and our economic system came into clearer focus for me when I learned about this. The figure whose work inspired this area of exploration is a person named Donald Cohen, and he wrote a co-authored book called The Privatization of Everything. Donald is also the founder and executive director of the Research and Policy Center in the Public Interest, and the focus of his work is on enriching the public good, metaphorically speaking, and inculcating an understanding of public goods in the most literal sense. So public goods and services, these are the basics that are in everyone's best interest for everyone to have. So for example, I don't have any children, but my taxes still pay for public education, and that is a good thing, because it is in my best interest if everyone's kids are well educated. Education is a public good. The privatization of our public goods explains a lot about why things feel like they don't work like they should in the United States. As Cohen wrote, for example, too often our answer to unsafe food is to make consumer choices, like shopping at high-end specialty stores, rather than citizen choices, like pressing for safe food for all. And it all starts with a very simple idea, which is that privatization does not actually make things more efficient as much as it hands public control over public goods, things that we all rely on, to private actors whose main goal is profit. Now, I want to trace quickly how public money turns into private wealth. So first, we have to consider that profit layer. The government may put out a bid, right? The contractor wins the bid to administer food benefits or process Medicaid claims or run the private prison or run a toll road, what have you. They'll take their cut, they'll take their, sometimes 20%, sometimes more, before that single service is delivered. And because we've now involved the private sector, we have to think about executive pay, we have to think about investor returns, we have to think about debt service, and all of that comes before the public benefit. So every dollar in profit is a dollar that is not feeding someone or paving a road or paying a teacher. And we are told, right, that involving the private sector in these public-private partnerships, that this is all in the interest of making things more efficient and making them cheaper, that the government, spends less and is less involved. But that isn't what happens in reality. Because efficiency in business and efficiency in private markets means something very different than efficiency in government. The role of government is not to make money. It is to provide services effectively. And when the logic of the marketplace gets applied to human services, it means denying care, it means slashing wages, and it means cutting corners. Privatized Medicaid in Iowa, for example, saved money by refusing coverage and then making appeals basically impossible. Private prisons cut costs by paying guards less and serving worse food and letting conditions spiral. Now, what you are looking at on the screen is the fact that between 1984 and 2015, the federal workforce has shrunk, but the contractors have grown. Now, the typical pattern that you will observe, Cohen told me, is that low bids will come in and they'll often win the work. But when costs rise later, the company will demand more funding, and the public can't really walk away. Or you might get something like what's called a put or pay clause. Now, this is where cities are forced to, for example, guarantee a set volume of trash for incinerators, or states who are paying for empty prison beds because they promised that in that contract that those prisons would be at 90% occupancy. So this represents the worst of both worlds, really. You get the profit-maximizing tendencies of the market, which typically something like competition is going to kind of hold in check, but you also get the guaranteed blank check of the government. So who really pays? Well, we pay, except we pay twice. First, we pay as taxpayers, who are funding these contracts, and then again, we pay as consumers of these products, when we pay things like tolls, or co-pays, or user fees. So a good example of this is the way that SNAP benefits are distributed on EBT cards. One of the contractors that the government uses to do this is a company called Conduent. Now, Conduent charges the users of EBT cards for every transaction that they make. They get a cut, right, of every time that you're using that public benefit. Conduent's top executives were paid $14 million in 2023. Thank you. I was waiting for that. I'm like, let's get some rage up in here, people. That is a less effective use. If I'm just looking at that objectively, I'm going, man, I mean, that's really not an effective use of federal funds. I'm not thrilled my tax dollars are going to that. Would really much prefer that this entire program were just administered by the government and every dollar were going to the people that are entitled to that public benefit. So the key question to ask, if we're thinking about what I said earlier about who's really in control and who's in power and who gets to make those decisions, is that it's not us. It's not the public in the current paradigm. Public funds are used to enrich private fortunes, and I think that is unjust. So this goes, oh, thank you. Thank you. Claps for injustice, why not? Yeah. This goes a really long way to explain why poverty and inequality and failing infrastructure feel so unsolvable. It's why it's like, oh my gosh, like we're throwing so much money at these problems. Why are they not getting any better? Because our government is spending tremendous amounts of money. Don't get me wrong, we are spending a lot of money, but it is pooling in the wrong places. So you've basically got a poverty industry that has emerged out of this problem, and companies profit most when those problems do not get solved. It's a bad incentive model. If the poor stopped needing help, firms like Conduent lose customers. They're not incentivized to make this problem go away. For 40 years, Americans have been taught that government is inefficient and that markets are just common sense and they are just the solution to that inefficiency. But this process of slowly turning citizens into consumers has undermined the democratic process. And when we think about how we move forward here, I think the first step begins with rebuilding trust in the idea of the public good. So not just the government, but the idea that there are things that we can only do well together. We make government worthy of that trust again. We make them transparent. We make them competent. We make them accountable. And we make public excellence the goal. Senadora working hard to make that happen. So there are a lot of smart people that are thinking about how we do this. My take after interviewing a lot of those smart people is that there are a couple things that stick out to me as no-brainers. One is campaign finance reform. The other is overturning something called Citizens United, which is essentially a law that decided that corporations are people and money is speech, and to hell with all of you. I think that needs to go. So, now we're going to talk about the thing that you probably have a lot more day-to-day experience with, which is the glories of private industry. And how do we make this better? I think that we need to revisit how we think about employment and work in the US, where an at-will employment scheme is the norm. Something that I learned in this work is that the way that we treat employment in the US is like singularly weird. Like there is no other country really that like does it the way that we do it. The opposite of an at-will employment is for-cause employment, in which the employer basically has to prove cause to a union or government agency in order to terminate you. It can't just be like, we want 1% more profits this quarter, so we're going to cut 1,000 people. I interviewed one anonymous source who works in high-level human resources for a multinational corporation, and he told me, quote, "For the contracts that we write for people outside the United States, having to be given a reason for why you're terminated, that's just called employment. But in the US, the main components of being let go are severance, COBRA subsidies for health insurance, and outplacement services. So the barrier to exit is very, very thin, and it makes individual workers expendable. The origins of at-will employment grew out of the post-Civil War era. So the Tennessee Supreme Court articulated this at-will employment scheme in 1884, and what they did was they granted employers divine rights over their employees. This remains the undergirding of US labor law, okay? The United States, unlike almost every other high-income country and many low-income countries, has not adopted any general protections against unfair dismissal or discharge without just cause, or even really any period of notice. And labor legislation in the intervening 140 years has been pretty slim. So, in an at-will employment environment where there is no counterweight from labor power, you are in an inherently David versus Goliath situation at work. Now, the 1935 National Labor Relations Act did make it illegal to fire employees for unionizing. It guarantees employees' right to organize, but even that faces a problem of enforceability. In order to make an employer abide by those laws, if you think you've been terminated unlawfully, you have to be willing to lawyer up. You have to be willing to take the time and the money to push back and basically enforce legality on that business or on that corporation. I've been involved with the Starbucks Workers United organizing effort this year, and they're doing amazing work. Starbucks has been charged with over 1,000 instances of breaking labor law. The retaliation is intense. And so what do you get? Well, you get a country where only 6% of the private sector is unionized. And you compare that to a country like Sweden that we talked about earlier, where you have 70% of workers who are in unions, who are collectively bargaining, who are thinking of their employment and thinking of their work as something they're doing together. So, as a result, many American workplaces where we spend many waking hours are quite undemocratic. This is a quote from a labor organizer named Hamilton Nolan and a labor journalist. The absolute power of the company and the boss to determine everything about a job's conditions is so common in America that most people never even think about it. It is widely seen as a state of nature. If you don't like the job, quit, we are told. A sneering rebuke that leaves unspoken the fact that you will then become homeless. The idea that workers deserve to be able to have real power at work is fundamentally un-American. Now, in the personal finance world, we talk a lot about negotiations. All of Chapter 2 of Rich Girl Nation is basically, here's how you can have the best shot at negotiating with someone who controls how much money you make. But to talk about negotiations without talking about unions is going to yield inherently limited results. The gender wage gap for unionized workers is lower than that for ununionized workers. As of 2023, women in unions make, on average, 19% more than women not represented by collective bargaining agreements. The racial wage gap is smaller for unionized workers too, and they are also more likely to have things like paid family leave. But it's not just unionized women or black and brown people who fare better. It's all unionized people. 2 sociologists who studied the past 50 years of earnings data for American men found that union membership resulted in an average of $1.3 million more in lifetime earnings. That is larger than the average gains from completing college, which is to say, their research found that in the last 50 years, joining a union had a more powerful effect on your lifetime earnings than a college education. If you want more money, start a union. And if you want to start a union, I recommend reaching out to the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, EWOC, Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee. They will connect you with staff organizers and tell you exactly what you need to do to exercise your legal right to unionize. Now, Hamilton is a labor organizer, but he is also a journalist. And there is another very useful example that comes from his own employment situation. Because unionizing makes more sense in some industries than others, especially for the time being. But there's another approach that I find equally interesting for smaller companies that do not have workforces in the tens of thousands. And the end goal in both of these cases is a more democratic workplace. Now, I told you I work in media. Defector Media is one example of a democratic workplace in my industry. Hamilton is a journalist at this company. Now, when new hires are brought on, they are given a percentage of the equity. All of their employees are also owners. So the business is cooperatively owned. Now, when new people come in, yes, this is going to dilute the existing owner's shares, but it also grants these new employees voting rights. It grants them a stake in the company. It literally gives them ownership. A 4-person board of managers runs their day-to-day operations, but certain decisions, like firing an editor-in-chief, for example, can be made with 2/3 of a staff vote. Another tenet of this publication's culture is complete salary transparency within a 2-tiered system of base salaries and target salaries. So there's a minimum that you can make, but then there's a target salary that everybody has, where if the business does well enough, those target salaries get paid instead. In addition to giving employees self-determination, collective ownership aligns the incentives of the staff with the business. So when Defector does well, its employees are the ones who reap the rewards. Now, this is a departure from how many traditional businesses are structured, in which the success of the company directly benefits a small ownership group or a small executive group, but then fails to improve the fortunes of the workers themselves who are responsible for that success. At Defector, in the absence of a complex pay hierarchy, the team profits directly from its labor. And to reflect the different market valuations of employees' labor, bless you, Defector categorizes its employees in groups with different target maximum salaries. So according to one of their founders, this is done in an effort to let the staff benefit when the company succeeds, while also recognizing that it's still true that different positions make different contributions and have different market values. So this leads me to what I am doing now. The central tension of my work, and I would say more broadly my life and my philosophical journey that I've gone on over the last couple years, is that we may recognize these issues and want to work toward changing them, and we still must exist and hopefully thrive in the world as it exists today. We can want to reform and improve that world, and we still need to make a living for ourselves, and we still need to prioritize our future security as much as possible. And after this journey, I knew that I wanted to carve out an area of my life and my business activity that put some of this into practice and to start contributing to the changes that I wanted to see. My new business, Mouthy Media, was co-founded at the end of 2024, and it operates what we call a redistributive model, in which the equity is shared by those building it, and an equal share is redistributed to the greater good. So currently, we give away 33% of net revenue. Now, part of the reason that I can afford to do this is because my own sale of Money with Katie back in 2021 provided me with that financial cushion that I needed to do something like this. And so when we decided that we were going to start giving away 1/3 of our net revenue, at first we were just choosing the causes ourselves. And then we thought about it, and we thought, well, part of this is about money, but the other part about this is power, and democratically distributing that power. So we thought, wouldn't it be cool if we gave that power to make these decisions about where this money goes to our subscribers, the people who are funding this work? Now, what was really interesting about starting this business and building its subscriber base is that our subscribers had already started forming local groups on their own. They started doing meetups. They started talking about what was going on in their towns and in their cities. And it connected people. And so we recently piloted our first democratically decided redistribution with the Colorado Dirty Little Liars, is what we call them, because our podcast is called Diabolical Lies. So we gave them $30,000, and we said, you decide what you do with this money. Keep it in your community if you want, give it somewhere else if you want, but it's completely up to you, no strings attached. You can use it for mutual aid, you can give it to politicians you want to support, it's up to you. We were a little nervous about this. We're like, who knows what they're going to do with this money? What if they just split it amongst themselves? That's not really what we thought was going to happen, but together they made a plan. They discussed where they wanted the money to go. Someone naturally rose into a leadership position in their group, organized the entire thing. They had meetings. They set up a voting system. And together they decided the final recipient organizations, and they reinvested the money into their community. And so in 2025, which is our first full year of business, we will have redistributed more than $100,000. We're very excited about that. So, I talk often, about how individual solutions fall short in the face of systemic inequity or structural oppression. But that makes it sound as though we as individuals are incapable of joining together to spark change from the ground up. My friend Grace Blakely, one of the people that I told you about in this conversation, she said it best. She said, sometimes I give these talks, and at the end, people raise their hands and they say, but what can I do? And she says, well, you're asking the wrong question. It's not what can I do, it's what can we do. And I think that that mission starts with a collective vision of a world that is going to work better for everybody. Thank you.
Hello?
Hello.
Thank you. I am a member of a family-run business that's been a capitalist company for 100 years.
Amazing.
And what I've noticed in my 61 years with the business, and I'm a proud advocate of getting companies out of the union, is when we were union-based, we were dealing with the Teamsters. And I recall my dad used to have to sit with a big guy because the union negotiators used to have a live pistol sitting on the desk. And people were killed and so forth. That was many years ago, and that's how unions operated. It was adversarial, and it was company versus employees, and there was no trust, etc. I managed to get our company out of the union, and I'm very proud of that. And today we have employee stock owner, well, we have matching contributions. We educate our employees early on about financial literacy, so they know how their money can go to work for themselves. We have medical care that is top notch. Our average employee driver, and it's rural, we're rural typically, is over $150,000 a year.
Wonderful.
We provide scholarships for our people. We take care of their medical care. We sit by their sides when somebody's hurting, etc. And we built a community. And we couldn't do that with a union structure because it was adversarial. And and I want to share this because I find as a for-profit company that I'm often looked down upon from nonprofits because our goal, actually our number one goal, you mentioned food, we are a food deliverer. And I was kind of insulted when it was profits over safety. Safety is our number one concern. The welfare of a driver is our number one concern. And the welfare of the food that we deliver to people to eat is our number one priority. Yes, we want to make money because we're in a capitalist business and we are woman-owned. Now we're 50% woman-owned, and that's how we run our business. So my question is, should I pay myself the same because I'm putting my capital at risk to run this business? And do you pay yourself the same as all of your employees in your new endeavor because it's a socialist business?
Thank you for your question. I appreciate that. I think first I wanted to, I know you don't have the mic anymore. Did you say that you have employee ownership? You have employees, your employees own part of the business too?
We do not, I misspoke, we do not have an employee stock ownership plan, but we're involved with, because it's involved in a private family company, but with their first paycheck, they have the ability to get matching funds to go into stock ownership plans. Because, and then I want to just go, 1%, $1,000 put by the government when a baby is born, that baby's a millionaire at 65. That's compounding interest. There's a lot of ways to get out of this. And it's this education. Compounding interest is the magic, but it's getting that money into the hands of the people early. So.
Sure. So to answer your question, my position on economic redistribution and how do we make this system more just is not, and as I think you may have seen in the defector model, is not that everyone should earn the same amount, or that if you are putting capital at risk, that you should not be compensated for the risk that you are taking. When I look at the larger picture, it sounds like you run a very equitable business. It sounds like you treat your people very well. And it sounds like you are operating with integrity, which is very important. My concern is that in the current system, that is left up to the individual, and not every employer has to operate with integrity. Obviously, we hope that everybody does, but I think it's important that there are structures in place that ensure that that integrity is being met. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was mine.
I love this.
Thank you.
So I share my thoughts and my opinions today as someone who agrees with you first, but as someone who is aware that there are lots of Americans especially who don't. The American psyche is built upon rugged individualism and the Protestant
right.
work ethic.
That's right.
And so these
You want to
things-
come up here? Because it sounds like you know a lot about this too.
I do, right. So, and I say this also as a gay man who has a master's in history from BYU. So I have seen what what objections from inside the house can look like.
Yeah.
But American civic education is in a very problematic place. Most people are very woefully unaware of what the Constitution is. They don't understand what democracy is or the goals of democracy are. And the biggest objections to virtually all of your ideas, I think, come into play in how we educate the current educated mass of Americans and the future of America. And then the other thing I think that comes into be the problem is we have seen when wonderfully socialist democratic ideals fall apart in the concentration of power. So, my question for you is, what are the practical solutions to overcome these very, very deep-seated cultural problems?
I think to tease that question apart a little bit, I think the practical solution side of, we've seen when these ideals don't live up to their stated goals, and how when power becomes reconcentrated again, that can go really poorly. For me, I do find a lot of inspiration from countries that have implemented a lot of these things and are thriving. So I think about a country like Denmark, for example. Denmark has very, very similar policies to Norway, to Sweden. I'm sure you know this. Denmark also has a thriving market economy. Their company, Novo Nordisk, invented the drug Ozempic, which completely changed the pharmaceutical industry. So I don't think, it is not my position that we kind of have to choose one or the other. We can either have innovation and competition and markets, or we can have all these other wonderful things that will improve people's lives. I think that these things exist hand in hand, and I think that there are countries where that is already being proven true. But to your cultural question, and I think that this is the part that I too struggle with and am still trying to understand and get to the bottom of and think about how we really can make this change, is that a lot of those countries do have much higher trust in their governments and in their populations writ large. There's a higher degree of social cohesion and trust in those places. And that is unfortunately something that we lack in the United States, and that it is going to be a long road to fix that. I think that what we are doing right now is part of how we fix that. I know that not everybody who heard what I had to say agreed with everything that I said. You may have found it insulting, right? But I think that we all want to see business and this country and this world that we all have to inhabit together work better and work better for more people. And I think that this is how that happens. I don't have the checklist of, here's how we overcome our cultural obsession with rugged individualism, but I will just say that as somebody that has been paying very close attention to the way that things have been shifting over recent years, I am of the opinion that we are reaching a bit of a breaking point, and it might not be up to us much longer, whether we get over that or not, or whether we start to recognize our interconnectedness. So I think whether we take that recognition and we build something better with it, or we drive ourselves further into the ground is ultimately up to us. But I love this country. I have a lot of faith that we can take the best of our rugged individualism, but leave the worst of it behind.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to have time for one more question, but there is a panel at the end, which Katie will be part of. So please stick with us and continue this conversation. A lot of people are pointing. Okay.
First of all, I would just like to thank you. I
Thank
really
you.
respect you and the integrity that you have up here to bring such a touchy subject to a lot of diverse people. I'm an educator, and I also have a big background in agriculture. We have cattle, horses, and things like that. And as an educator, one thing that really stuck out to me was question the systems, not the people. And I just had a question on what are some ideas or the number one thing that you would really try to teach that to especially our younger generation coming up, and if you could possibly maybe think of it more in like the rural agricultural industry, that'd be great. But if not, then just what is your like number one thing to help teach students?
That's a good question, because I don't know much about that industry. And I'm also, I guess I think I'm definitely not an educator, but I primarily obviously speak with adults. I actually want to ask you, what do you, in your classrooms with these kids, do you do things that teach them about teamwork and working together and how you can achieve more together?
We do. I guess I should tell you, I'm an equine instructor. So
Oh,
I
very
teach
cool.
horse classes. So every student in our program has a horse that they bring with them.
Very cool.
So teamwork is obviously a huge portion of what we teach, but something that I'm really trying to bring into our classes more so than I guess historically in the past is leadership qualities. And a lot of people kind of think of that, which I know this is a great place to talk about this because that's why we're here, right?
Yeah.
But a lot of people will look at that and be like, leadership and horses, but that ideally is what a relationship with a horse is leadership. And so we talk a lot about teamwork and transparency, and integrity is something I've heard from multiple people yesterday and today, or last night and today so far. And that's what we really try to teach, because when you work with something such as a horse, they're such a large animal and they can't verbally communicate with you. You have to learn how to have those attributes, I guess. But the thing that I'm struggling with is helping people tie that in with people. Because, we're people and we're not as trusting or sometimes as kind as like animals can be.
That's a really good question. So I am struck by the use of the word integrity again, because integrity really means wholeness. And it means that to me, your ideals and your values are matching up with the way that you exist in the world and the way that you treat other people and your behavior. And I've never been a teacher, but I remember being in, 12 years of Catholic school, and there was always a really, really big emphasis on the golden rule, treating others the way that you want to be treated. I think a lot of this and a lot of my own philosophy comes down to, in some ways, that same moral compass and that same moral code. And it sounds like you're a wonderful teacher. It sounds like you really, really care about your students. I think that's beautiful. And I think that instilling that core direction is the basis for everything else that we have talked about today. That your fellow human is just as deserving of a good life as you are, wants to work just as hard as you do. And I think that you can help those kids build trust in one another and develop a trusting view of the world and an outlook that is really grounded in that moral code. Because I do think, to the question about civic education, I think that basis is kind of fundamental to all of this. And if you reject that, none of this is going to matter, right? Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
And surprise, we're going to make time for one more question.
Oh. Anyone want to yell at me? Anyone mad?
Feel free.
Oh.
I have maybe two. The first was, when are you running for office?
Oh my gosh.
The second was a little more specific.
Yeah.
We've seen, I think, living in the West, and particularly in this community, where public lands, public kind of owned or government-owned resource is so important to us personally, socially, culturally, economically, and yet those public lands are owned by all citizens.
Sure.
And I think sometimes that like deep personal connection is so obvious to maybe people in this room. I'll make some assumptions there. But people that maybe never get to go to Yellowstone or see the Tetons, they maybe hear about it in a classroom, don't have that same personal connect. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little more to one of your concepts about public ownership and of those public resources as they might apply to public lands and potential selling or decisions on sale of public lands.
Yeah, I hear you. Sure. So to recontextualize us there, the point about public lands or the public ownership of those goods, that the government owns these lands, is essentially something that Bruning points to as this belongs to all of us as citizens, and that the decisions about those things should be made democratically. So in our current system, we do democratically elect leaders to represent us and make our voices heard to those people, and then they vote in ways, ideally, that are in accordance with those requests. I think the thing that I would point to as far as the sale of public lands is that is a good example of what I was talking about when I said public resources being used to fund private wealth and private profits. I think the private ownership of those things leads us down a bad path. So I'm not sure if you're asking specifically about the social wealth fund in particular, but I think the emphasis that I want to make there is that the perspective of that social wealth fund plan is that those things remain in public ownership and remain public goods, in case that was unclear. Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I was almost wondering aloud if people that didn't have that maybe personal relationship, if they understand more of the economic importance to them as a citizen, even if they're not experiencing those public lands, that they still give value to them in other ways.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you thinking about it out loud. I think a lot of this comes down to, I don't want to use the word local protectionism because that sounds a little bit, it's not quite what I mean, but I think that those decisions are made at the local level where the people who are going to be most impacted by those decisions live, I think is critical. So I don't know if your average person who lives in Palm Beach, Florida, and has never been to the Tetons understands the value of that land or what it might mean to the people who live here. But I think in an ideal scenario, the decisions about what happens to that land is made by the people who live right here, who that land, theoretically belongs to. Does that help? I know it's a, I appreciate the question.
Double surprise. One more question, here we go.
Okay.
I think this is all fascinating, and you've brought up a lot of good things. What I want to say is I think the biggest issue, and it goes back to the civic education, it goes back to public lands, is that in our 2024 election in Wyoming, 23% of the people voted. And if we don't vote, we end up with the leaders that are trying to take our public lands and sell them for private profit and not put them back into the system. So this is more, it's not as much a question as it is a plea for you to put some of your brain power and your cohort's brain power into civic education and getting people to vote in order to achieve this kind of system.
Yeah, I will say that I think you're right. And I have been pretty amazed by the New York City mayoral election and the power of canvassing. I have found a lot of hope from the fact that someone that was polling at below 1%, that had no name recognition, that nobody knew a year ago, basically just toppled a political dynasty with a relentless focus on affordability. 50,000 volunteers, 50,000 door knockers, people are excited again. And it really, I think, has revived a sense of civic engagement in that city. And I think it's a roadmap for what could happen all over this country. So I appreciate that, and I agree. And I think we have proof right now that the tide is turning, things are changing. Thank you.